Hi, this is Tim Weber from South Texas College, and today coming to you with a video on death and dying. And you're probably going to think, wow, that's really kind of a morbid subject. But I think what you'll find, many of my students actually, after they've gone through this chapter, find that it is something that they appreciate talking about and learning about. There aren't many classes where you actually get to touch on this topic in any depth at all. And so here we go. And this is the first of two videos, actually. We'll take half of it today and half of it in another session. So in this chapter, we'll be looking at death and dying, and also death in terms of its relationship to hope. We'll actually look at developmental changes in how people see death and how they perceive it, how they cope with it at various points in life. And we'll look at dying and coming to terms with death as well. We'll look at bereavement, and the second part of the video also will pick up that topic, as well as how we can be of service to those who are grieving. So let's get started then and get into the material, and let's get a pointer that you can see. Okay, here we go. All right. So first of all, just to get a fancy college word out of the way, Tenetology is the study of death and dying. That's the formal name for study of this area of life. This especially has focused on the social and emotional aspects of that topic. So studies that have been done reveal that there is hope even in death, that people can come to an acceptance of the inevitability that at some point they too will pass away, and that death can also give us an opportunity to reaffirm the value of life, our individual lives, as well as those that others that have gone on. So we'll have a little closer look here then. Whoopsie. Okay. So let's have a look at how death has changed just within the last 100 years. First of all, people live longer before dying in general. Life expectancy has almost doubled, 78 on average, and higher if you're a woman. 100 years ago, half of babies died before age 5. Many women died in childbirth as well. So a much different picture today. People living to much greater age, fewer people dying very early in the lifespan. Also, dying takes longer. 100 years ago, once one of your vital organs began to fail, it was a very short time, hours or maybe days, but usually hours, before finally the rest of the body failed as well. Now, consider today. We can keep a person's heart beating for years, even though their brain might be still functioning. Respirators can keep them breathing. Dialysis, even, think about that. Without dialysis, many people would die in a very short period of time. So all in all, though, dying tends to be now a much more lengthy process, and people may spend long periods of time, if you will, sort of suspended between life and death. So, a little different. Today, what you're going to see, most deaths occur in hospitals or on the way to the hospital. 100 years ago, people mostly died at home. Now think about that. Home is a place where you feel familiar, where you feel comfortable, where your cherished things are with you, and the most important people in your life are. And so people often died with family and friends surrounding them. Today, death in the hospital setting, unfamiliar, many unfamiliar people, uh, medical procedures being done that might be unfamiliar, and in some cases, family members not being able to be as present with that person as they would have years ago in the home setting. So death today can be more frightening, more lonely than it was years ago. And the main causes of death have changed. 100 years ago, the most common cause of death was infectious disease of some sort, as well as childbirth, whether that is risks for the woman or the mother or the infant. Today, it's quite different. Disease before age 50, pretty rare for people to die of it at that point. Almost all newborns survive, and even more their mothers. So again, we have a much different picture in terms of what causes death. Today, we see more cause of death, leading causes of death being degenerative diseases like heart disease and cancer, rather than these infectious diseases. And then there is the question about, well, what happens after you die? Well, 100 years ago, people generally had some very, very strong ideas about what would happen. Some firmly held ideas, in most cases, ideas that would give them a sense of hope and a sense of comfort. But today, there are fewer people who are so sure about those answers as to what happens after you die. People somewhat less religious today, and so often it is more of an unknown to people. So all in all, we can say that in some ways, the whole idea of dying may be kind of more scary to people today than it might have been 100 years ago. So let's examine then the progression of how people think about death and cope with it throughout the lifespan. Our textbook, Berger, has a good statement about that, saying the meaning assigned to death, either whether that's person's own death or the death of another person, depends partly on their cognitive maturation and personal experience. So what level of cognitive ability do they have? And as they go through childhood, we know that children, as they're developing, go through a number of ways of thinking and able to think more complexly as time goes on. Personal experience, again, children's experience with death is going to be much more limited than that of adults. So let's have a look. So when we look at death in childhood, children have a different perspective of death than adults do. So when a loved one dies, the child may have feelings that they are not able to verbalize. They might have thoughts that they can't really quite put into words. Of course, even us adults have that sometimes, but children even more so with their limited vocabularies. And so sometimes they simply have to act out their thoughts and feelings, maybe through impulsiveness, maybe acting out toward an aggressive behavior towards others, or maybe simply by going from one pole emotionally to another, maybe extremely happy one day and morbidly sad the next, and maybe even swings in emotion just within even minutes as a result of trying to cope with the death of a loved one. And think about that. Children's ability to manage their emotions is not at all mature yet. So even though adults may be able to moderate those emotions, children may have little ability to do that. So they're simply expressing what they feel without really sort of monitoring it. So maybe sometimes we have a child losing a loved one, and we may expect them simply to get over it. They're not going to get over it. They're never going to be quite the same as they were before. It's going to have an impact on them. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be long-term a negative impact, but do know that they're not going to be the same. So we shouldn't expect them just to go back to the same as they always were. But that said, the interesting thing is kids generally, they don't dwell on that either. They seem to often be able to move forward in their lives even sooner than the adults that are around them. And sort of appropriate because as they're developing, yes, they need to progress in their development. So children also may take certain explanations literally, and sometimes we try to buffer them from death by saying things like, well, yeah, grandma's just sleeping, or, grandpa went on a long trip. And they may literally think this is true. Remember that especially young children are logical. They're literal thinkers, not logical necessarily. Literal thinkers, they don't really get the analogies. And so we are better off to tell them what has actually happened, but explain that in terms that they can understand, and taking into account their feelings about it. And think about it. If you say grandma's sleeping, well, the child may think, well, okay, well, why doesn't she wake up then? Or grandpa went on a trip. Oh my gosh, it's sure a long trip. He's left us. He doesn't care about us. You can see that maybe we're better off to tell them what's happened. Okay. Now, in terms that they can understand at their level of development. So even young children have some experience with death. They may have had a pet that passed away, things like that. And we can say it's a little bit like that, the same kind of thing happened to grandma's body or grandpa's body. And, so we won't be able to see them walking around anymore. And at this point, that's also a good time when we might also relay any particular beliefs that we have about an afterlife and say, well, we believe that, grandma is whatever in heaven or reincarnated, if that's a person's belief or whatever. And that can be very helpful to the child. And then talking about, their feelings about grandpa not being here with us in this life anymore. Okay. This also goes to the question about, a family member passed away. Surely we shouldn't take that child to the funeral, right? I'm going to push back on that idea. I'm going to say, you know what? It may be a good idea to let that child attend the funeral. However, if we're going to do that, we need to prepare them for that. We need to explain, what has happened to that person and what they're going to experience at that funeral and what it means. Why are we doing that? Why are we doing that? To remember them, to appreciate their lives and so on. Okay. If we do that and we provide that support for the child to talk about, again, their feelings about that, often adults are surprised. Often the child is able to really cope with that goodbye to that person more readily. If we exclude the child, don't let them attend, they may later feel that they didn't have that opportunity to say goodbye to that person one last time. They may feel guilty, or they may feel they were cheated from that opportunity. So think twice about excluding kids from that, but do prepare them. Now, children who also are become aware that they are dying, um, usually their biggest concern is that they're going to be abandoned, that they're going to be left alone. And so they need frequent and caring contact. And that being there with them is more important than reasoning and logic in helping them cope with that idea that they themselves could pass away. Um, might also mention, just going back to when children lose a loved one, one of the other things that often can be important, sometimes a child will want to have one of those person's possessions. And that can be actually a very healthy thing because, again, that is a way of sort of remaining in contact psychologically with that person that's passed away and remembering them and appreciating them. And so that is something that, in the right context, can actually be beneficial, allowing that child to keep one of that loved one's belongings. Okay. So as kids get older, though, they get into the level of concrete operations and begin to start thinking more logically. And at that point, then they may seek actual facts about death, or especially the death of a specific facts about the death of a loved one. But that said, they may become less anxious about death and dying as they can put it more in perspective. Now, here's a very interesting study that was done, and it always touches me. So children were asked, a mouse has passed away, and so, will he ever be alive again? Most children knew that that wasn't going to happen. But interestingly, they thought, well, the mouse, he still might be thirsty. Maybe he can still feel sick, especially the youngest children. Maybe he wants to go home. And this one always touches me the most. Does he still love his mother? Almost all young children said, yes, he still loves his mother. It seems that love endures even into death in the youngest children's mind. This kind of also interested me because I thought, it's so interesting that such a high percentage of children think about some sort of afterlife here. Although as they get older, there's less and less of that. I thought that's interesting. Do we have a natural tendency to have a belief in an afterlife that we are sort of drumming out of people as they get older? Something to think about. Okay, let's have a look at then death in adolescence as well as emerging adulthood. So adolescents, teenagers, emerging adults, 18 to 25-year-olds. So we'll just kind of lump them all together. And at this point, we'll find that often death is less of a concern. And people in this age group seem to have less fear of it. Remember, this is also the age group of feelings of invulnerability, that invulnerability fable that, bad things happen to people, but it won't happen to me. And also, this is a point in time when the teenager, emerging adult's brain needs more stimulation, craves more stimulation. So, thrills and excitement might win out over fear of death in many cases. And that's why they may take risks that put them at risk for accidents and so forth. So 100 years ago, in this age group, disease was the most common cause of death. But if you have a look at these pie charts here, that sure has changed. And today, now, accidents make up the most probable cause of death in this age group. And even though diseases are, they're in there, notice that suicide and homicide almost almost nil 100 years ago in this age group. Now, this age group, 12% die of suicide, 16% homicides. In other words, what, victim of a violent crime. So these violent ends of life, much more common now. Accident, suicide, homicide. Disease is now much smaller portion of deaths in this age group. Death may be romanticized within this age group as well. And so that adolescent getting their driver's license, driving recklessly, might say, yeah, you know, hey, maybe I'll get killed driving recklessly, but you know what? Everybody will remember me, how I took that corner and how I beat people in that race and all of that. They're going to remember how crazy I was, and you know, they sort of can romanticize that. You get the idea. And by the way, this also may be one of the reasons that, again, suicide has become more common, because yes, if you can romanticize your death, then you can, you know, sort of excuse yourself in terms of doing that, or sort of reason that it might be a good thing. Okay, so let's have a look at death in adulthood then. So perception of death changes now because adults are responsible for a family, many of them, or a romantic partner in many cases, may be responsible for work, may have goals that they want to achieve in the world of work and career. And so now death tends not to be romanticized anymore, but something that's dreaded or something to be avoided or at least postponed. So many adults then decide, hey, it's time to change my behavior, grow up, and maybe I should quit drinking so much, or maybe I should start to get some exercise, eat right, and so on and so forth. Okay. Adults tend not to readily accept the death of others when they look at it, and especially the young. So they look at that and say, my goodness, a person that age could die. Imagine what could happen here. And not to mention that, yes, it doesn't seem fair. As a matter of fact, one of the types of death that is most difficult for an adult to accept is the death of their child. It just doesn't seem right. It seems to go against nature even, that the child should die before the parent. Very hard on adults. When adults know that they're terminally ill, they tend to worry most about leaving something important undone or leaving behind family members. That's usually their biggest concern. That was illustrated in Randy Pouch's last lecture. Now, this has been a few years ago, but Randy Pouch was a college professor, and he got pancreatic cancer, I'm trying to say that. And he knew it was fatal. He had two very young children. I'm going to say they were maybe 2 and 3 years old or something of that nature. And so, yeah, he worried about leaving something undone. He wouldn't be around, he knew, to tell them the things that teenagers need to know when they're growing up. And so what he did is he wrote it all out as a lecture that he would give, and then he recorded that lecture to be passed on to his young children when they got into adolescence. By the way, you can punch that up on YouTube and you can watch Randy Pouch's last lecture. It's really interesting, the things that he wanted to say to his children as they got older and how he did that. So I encourage you to do that if you'd like. Now, what about death in late adulthood? Actually, as people get into late adulthood, even though they know they're closer to death, death anxiety tends to decrease. Hope, on the other hand, tends to rise. So in older adults, they begin often to accept their mortality, that their life is going to have an end eventually. And they also begin often showing more concern about those who are going to live on after them. When they do that, these things, that's a sign of mental health. It's not a sign that they're giving up on life, but rather they're being realistic and they're being concerned for others. So as many older adults accept death, they may take care of things like writing their will, designating others to be their healthcare proxies in case they're incapacitated. They might reconcile with estranged family members and try to mend those fences in the family. They might even plan out their own funeral. And so again, sometimes we look at that and think, oh, how morbid, I guess they're, we better keep an eye on them, that sort of thing. But in fact, that doesn't mean they're intending to end their lives. That is simply a sign that they're trying to take care of things for others, make it easier for others when they pass on. So acceptance of death doesn't mean the elderly have given up on living. Now, let's have a look at the intersection between death, religion, and hope. So, interestingly, they found people who think that they might die soon more likely than others to believe in life after death. When it seems to be more of a reality, it also seems to trigger an urge to believe that there's something more. Every world religion provides various rites and customs to honor the dead, as well as comfort the living. I want to emphasize that. Honoring the dead, but also these things are to serve those who remain. And you can see that customs that are associated with death vary greatly by the religion and by the cultural group. So, for example, the upper picture you see here, somewhere in Asia, where it is believed that when people die, they go on to watch over their village, watch over the people there. So when they die, everybody in that village turns out to honor that person. Now, as we look at the lower picture, notice that rites having to do with a person's death also vary greatly. So in some religious or cultural groups, the family of the person who passed away is involved with physically preparing that person's body for death. In other cultural groups, that person is forbidden to touch the body. Those family members are forbidden to touch the body of the deceased person. Complete opposite. Okay, so we have to recognize very different ways of observing this, sometimes even opposites. So, although not everybody observes religious customs, those who care for the dying in their families need to be extremely sensitive to cultural traditions. And I think, for example, if you happen to work in a hospital where people might pass away, might die, there may be various observances that people want if they should pass away, or if they, or family may want that. And, I'll give you one example. This is maybe an extreme example, but I read about a case where there was a person who they observe traditional Native American ceremonies. and they were passing away in the hospital. And so members of that tribal group arrived to perform the various rites that were done in that ethnic group. Involve things of chanting and dancing and so on. Now, imagine if you're working in that hospital, how are you going to be sensitive to their cultural traditions? How are you going to work with that in such a way to give them the opportunity to observe those cultural traditions while still maintaining what you need to in that hospital? It may take a great deal of thought in how we would handle that. So I just wanted to get you thinking about that, particularly if you're working with situations where you encounter the dying in their families. Okay, now, little side trip here. Near-death experiences, something that's been reported by maybe about 40% or so of people who've had a close brush with death. So this may occur when someone, their heart stops, stop breathing, and then they are revived sometime later. Some people report it, but not everyone. Here are some of the things that are commonly reported, and it's interesting that a high number of these near-death experiences are very similar, although there are many exceptions to what we're seeing here. So people often report that they experience leaving their body, and sometimes the experience of feeling as if they were hovering above their body at some height, the encounter of some bright light, and sometimes a tunnel leading to that bright light, which they feel drawn to. Often feelings of peacefulness or joy are reported, although not always. Sometimes it's actually the opposite, but more often than not, it's peacefulness. And then various other things, maybe meeting with deceased friends or relatives that have passed on before them, maybe beings such as angels or saints and so on. Religious elements often are consistent with whatever that person's religious background is. But these are very commonly reported experiences when people have a near-death experience. Now, having said that, not everybody has these experiences. Actually, I ran into a friend of mine that I hadn't seen for years over in HEB, grocery store. And I said, "Oh, how have you been?" And he said, "Oh, you know, I died." And I said, "What? Aren't you standing right here?" And he said, "No, I died." He said, I was over at the island, and I was coming back over the bridge, and somewhere I was coming over the bridge, everything started to get dark and dim, and then nothing." And he said, "What happened is," he said, "my heart stopped, and the car came to rest against a pole at the other end of the bridge. And luckily, someone who was a nurse right away came to the scene and gave him CPR and until they came back and got his heart going." And I said, "Oh, did you have one of those near-death experiences?" And he said, "No, nothing happened. It just got dark. And then the next thing I knew, I was in the hospital." So I didn't get to hear about one of those. But anyways, interestingly, after people do have near-death experiences, it often has a significant impact on them. Many survivors adopt a more spiritual approach for life, searching for the important spiritual sorts of practices. Often, they also become more concerned about the needs of others and what can they do that will benefit others. And they tend to become less materialistic. It's not so much about how much money or what I can achieve in my career, but what can I do for others. Very interesting, the impact that is common. So, of course, everyone asks, well, is this near-death experience a window into life after death? Is it just what the brain does when it's not getting enough oxygen? Is it We don't know. That's the reality. Anybody that tells you that they know for sure, we don't really know. Okay. All right. So let's then also look at um, perceptions of death. And so, yeah, if we were to ask you the question, you know, you're going to die someday, just like everybody else does. And so, if you've got to die, yeah, how would you like to go? You know, what would you like it to be like? What would you call a good death, if you will? I'm just not real comfortable with that, but some people ask the question that way. Well, here's what people said when they were asked this sort of question. Most common responses were people wanted a death that was peaceful, that was quick, that was not a protracted struggle to avoid death. They wanted a death that occurred at the end of a long life in familiar surroundings that they were comfortable with family and friends present, and also without undue pain, confusion, or discomfort. That's what people generally said that they were interested in. On the other hand, what did people say they wanted to avoid? They didn't want to really die from some extended illness or disability. They didn't want to lose mental clarity at the end. Isn't that interesting? They wanted to be aware of what was going on. That's pretty interesting. They also wanted to avoid isolation. And you can see that through the entire lifespan, even here when it comes to death. We humans, we're social creatures. We want to be with our friends and family. We don't want them to be kept from us due to maybe medical procedures and what have you. So that's some common thoughts about how people think of a good or not so good death. Okay, so next time we'll begin picking up attending to the needs of the dying and the grieving. Should add that in there. And we'll be looking at that, things like hospice, comfort care, the question of when is a person actually dead. We'll look at passive euthanasia, do not resuscitate orders, DNR orders. We'll look at also active euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, which does exist in the world. We'll look at advanced directives like having a living will, a healthcare proxy, and the importance of that. And then we'll look at the grieving process, bereavement as well as grief. How does that differ from mourning as well? We'll look at different types of grief. And we'll also look at some grief research. And then we'll look at how we can be of service to those who are bereaved, who are grieving as well. And that will actually finish out the whole course. So we'll quit there, and I'll pick up the rest of it in the next video.